Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're having a fabulous Christmas season. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I pressed down the accelerator, listening to some country music on the radio with Tim McGraw singing What Room Was the Holiday In, as I made my way quickly to my cleaning job. The mansion I was heading to was spectacular in every way. It was lavishly decorated with stunning contemporary furnishings throughout, along with modern artworks on the walls from the likes of such masters as Damien Hirst, Jeff Koons and Gerard Richter. On the outside, the symmetrical house was a modern white square building, with the architectural influences that included sculptural ornamental accessories engaged in the brickwork, which sprinkled the place with a Georgian impression, but with a profound modern twist. I tapped in my entry code at the intercom system, at the ornate black wrought-iron gates, full of fabulously elaborate swirls and leaf-like designs. It automatically opened for me. My car tyres swished smoothly down the slick, well-appointed driveway towards the house. I backed my car. I switched off the engine, pulled up the handbrake, and listened to the rest of the song. Then I switched off my blaring radio and slammed my car door shut behind me. I retreated to my trunk, pulling out my cleaning basket, and I began to cross the well-appointed, rather grandiose yard, with its high infusions of white roses framed by hedges of lavender, along with a formal checkerboard display of alternating ornamental white stones, terracotta tiles, and a creeping ground cover, with clusters of miniature purple flowers. With my basket in my hands, I began to walk up the sandstone steps towards the mansion. I stopped dead in my tracks. I saw the young woman I worked for, Mrs. Spanarson, sitting on the top step outside the grandiose walnut front door. She was staring vacantly into space like a gog-eyed goldfish. She didn't even notice me as I neared my hesitant approach. She seemed so lost in a world of her own. I felt sure I would almost be intrusive, invading her space, but her demeanour prickled my antennae. I realised something was terribly wrong with her. My walking pace increased its urgency as I darted towards the young woman, who was dressed still in her flowering pyjamas, while her flattened blonde hair clung to her head in a messy, dishevelled heap. "Are you all right, Mrs. Spanarson?" I asked. "Are you all right?" The woman was behaving exceedingly weird, as if she was almost locked up in a trance-like state. I put down my basket quickly and sat down on the step next to the woman, looking at her through perturbed brown eyes. A feeling of alarm rose up in my belly like a high tide. "Mrs. Spanarson," I repeated, raising my voice, "are you all right?" There was still no response from the woman, so I shook her slightly. Then she seemed to jolt out of her stupor. "Mrs. Spanarson," I repeated, "are you all right? Are you all right?" Suddenly the woman began to shake and tremble violently. "Paul," she gulped, "Paul, in the study." She couldn't say the words, for they eluded her like a hot air balloon blowing away in the wind. I quickly ran to the study, knocking urgently on the door. "Mr. Spanarson! Mr. Spanarson!" I called. "Are you there?" But there was no answer. I was met with a silence. I pushed open the door. It creaked open ominously. Then, sitting there in a slouched position, slumped over his desk in a pool of his own blood, was Mr. Spanarson. I could see the gun had fallen out of his fingers. There was a note scribbled on a white pad, spattered with droplets of blood, next to his deceased body, saying 3 words: "I'm sorry." I stood there for a moment, gulping the air like an oxygen-starved goldfish, trying to absorb the gravity of what had transpired. The office seemed eerily quiet, apart from the tick-tock of a grandfather clock against the wall. Everything seemed so surreal, as if I was wrestling with a dream state that I was failing to exit. The man had killed himself, but why? By all accounts, he was happily married to his wife, who was 15 years his junior. They lived together in this sumptuous, somewhat pretentious mansion, in a splendidly idyllic green leafy Seattle neighbourhood. What on earth would have induced him to do such a crazy, nonsensical, irrational thing, like taking his own life. Finally, in a delayed reaction, I came to my senses and called for help. The coroner arrived promptly on the scene, followed by the police. The police had a therapist or counsellor on duty that appeared to be calming down the very distressed Susan Spanarson, while I stood on ceremony, trying to answer the many questions that were being asked, many of which I didn't know the answers to, but I did my level best to appease the police. The officer investigating the death was thorough in every way, a man of few words, but with eyes as discerning as an eagle. He was discussing everything studiously with the coroner. "The body is still warm," the coroner said. "My guess is he blew his brains out an hour ago." "That's recent," said the officer, looking rather aghast. "The poor wife must have heard the bullet going off. We'll have to take her in for questioning, but she's a gibbering wreck at the moment. Do you think there's anything suspicious about this death?" "Obviously, we'll be doing the autopsy, but by my book it looks pretty clear-cut to me. It must have been a suicide. I don't see anything out of alignment here, but we'll see. You can never be too sure about anything. We have to go through all the procedures with a fine tooth comb." Before long, the body was taken on a gurney to the morgue, where a post-mortem would be performed to affirm that the manner of death was not suspicious. I knew the man had blown his brains out. Mrs. Spanarson would not be capable of even killing a fly. Even a rocket scientist could discern that she was genuinely distraught. "Will you be all right?" the policeman finally asked me. "Do you think you could stay with Mrs. Spanarson, or call someone to be with her, like a relative perhaps, or a very good friend? I can see that she's exceedingly fragile. She needs lots of emotional support right now." "I'll stay with her," I volunteered. The crime scene cleaners were only coming in the morning to clean up the mess. In my opinion, it couldn't wait. That was far too late. So I took the initiative to clean up the bloody mess myself, whether I was authorised to do so or not. I certainly didn't care about that. I sterilised the surfaces, found myself wiping and disinfecting the grisly stomach-churning stuff, using a plethora of hot water and bleach, along with other cleaning materials, as well as gloves and a mask. I found pieces of skull on the floor, as well as brain material, clots of congealed blood. It was a nasty job, but someone had to do it. I would leave the bags of waste, which included the gloves I was using, the cloths, and even the clothes I was wearing, for the clean-up team to collect in the morning. It would all be deemed biohazardous waste. I couldn't have Susan Spanarson entering her husband's office under any circumstances while it was in this deplorable state. As I was cleaning up, I noticed a white plastic basket filled with letters of final demands. I sifted through them. I ascertained that this wealthy couple were possibly poorer than I was. It was a sobering thought that hit me like an ice bucket of cold water over the head. The fully furnished designer house they were living in was rented out. Nothing inside the home actually belonged to them. All their credit cards were completely maxed out. I wondered if Susan Spanarson even knew about this. Did she know that her deluxe fashionable lifestyle was all based on a lie? In reality, everything they owned belonged to the bank. I was right. It certainly was a huge shock to Susan Spanarson to discover that not only did they not own the furnishings, but even the house itself was rented. In reality, the only things of hers were the clothes on her back. She was soon to discover that some of her flamboyant pieces of jewellery that she thought were real were just fabulous fakes. She'd asked me to stay at her house indefinitely, as she valued my friendship. Unfortunately, I had to be the one to break the horrifying news to Mrs. Spanarson. The landlord wanted her out by the 1st of the month and no later. Ostensibly, this posh, elegant, regal-looking home was like any other cheap rental property, probably no different, really. It was more than a little brutal in the inauspicious circumstances. "Did you really have no idea you were living in a rented, fully furnished home that wasn't even yours?" I asked her. She insisted I called her Susan. I had absolutely no idea. I know now why he killed himself. He couldn't stomach telling me that we were being thrown out of this mansion, a mansion I loved that wasn't even ours. Our whole lives were based on a sad misconception, a big lie. I didn't have a clue about it. I did love him, though, despite everything. What Susan didn't know was that her husband had been nursing an insidious secret. He was caught up in the web of a gambling addiction. He had dwindled away their vast fortune at a casino, unable to subsist on the humiliation of pleading poverty. When you have wealth, power, and status, falling from such a towering pedestal can be more than a little crushing. It would seem when you're trying to create the impression of success, like so many people attempt to achieve on social media platforms, posting up fabulously swanky pictures of themselves, to make all their adoring followers and fans feel positively inadequate. It's the gloss you want people to see, not the rot or the black rampant mould that is festering in the background. The decay is deceptively hidden, covered up, concealed, so behind the happy faces, expensive designer clothes, yachts, bottles of fizzing champagne, the picture may indeed be a lot less attractive, for if you get close enough, you might just see the putrefaction. That's why they go to great lengths and measures to conceal it from your eyes. For if you were to gleam a whisper of the truth on the wind, it might break them up so hard like a fragile, delicate piece of porcelain china. For somehow living with the pretence that their illusionary, delusional life is to be envied, it brings them a measure of self-esteem, to cling to rather like a lifeboat lost at sea. It helps elevate those flagging egos, brings solace and affirmations that will give them a sense of significance and self-worth that they so ravenously crave, when in reality they fail to realize that every soul on the planet is precious beyond price. Unfortunately, said Susan, I don't think my prideful, rather smug husband could have coped with a mediocre standard of living. He loved living a lavish lifestyle. All the time, I can't believe it, we were driving luxurious cars, living in a palatial mansion owned by the bank. My husband loved to maintain that aura of grandiosity, loftiness, eminence, stateliness, if you know what I mean. It inflated his persona. It authenticated him, gave him a sense of pomposity, a vaingloriousness, as underneath it all he possibly only had the self-esteem of a gnat. I hate to say it, but it's true. Everything in our lives was a masquerade. He loved people to be in awe of us, impressed by our status, you see. She said, looking at me earnestly. I'm going to be very honest with you, Nora. When you mix in high circles among the wealthy and aristocracy, or elite if you like, it's so important to bluff or give the impression of owning the world, even if you don't. I think they're guilty of all doing this, all of them, the whole lot of them. It's a craving they have, to be respected, honoured and admired, you see. I think I get it, I said, although I wasn't sure that I actually did. Trying to pretend to be something you're not, or falsely living above your means, was not something I could fully comprehend. What are you going to do, Susan, I asked. Where on earth are you going to live, once your landlord throws you out? I'm not exactly sure, said Susan. I've got no money, but I do have a genuine diamond necklace that I can sell, that my husband didn't get to make into costume jewellery, I'm glad to say. Maybe I can use the funds to start my own business, but I don't know what I would do. Maybe you'd like to come into business with me, Nora. We could start a cleaning company together. Please, please say yes, she asked me with begging eyes. I now have to be a working girl like you, no longer a lady of leisure. It's funny, I said. How do you feel about cleaning blood and guts up for a living, Susan? When I said this, I wasn't joking, not even for a single second. Do you think you could do it? The job that other people loathe doing. You see, after I cleaned up after your husband, the crime scene clean-up team arrived the following morning. They commented on the great job I'd done cleaning up after your husband. They told me that there is money to be made in this business, as no one wants to do it. So there's a gap in the market. We could buy a van and all the materials we need with your diamond necklace, and you're also welcome to move in with me. Susan looked agog. You mean clean up bodies of dead people, she asked, looking appalled. I mean, what kind of a job is that? I'm just being practical. It's a perfect opportunity to make money. But you have to have a stomach of iron to be able to do it. The question is, do you think you've got that kind of stomach? So in a nutshell, that was how two people came together in an unlikely union. The high society Susan Spanarson, the meagre little me, that had been making a living cleaning people's homes. We chose to become crime scene cleaners. We engaged in a training course. In our job we were required to wear biohazard suits, face masks, respirators, multiple pairs of disposable gloves. When we first started to work as crime scene cleaners, we began to ask ourselves whether we were stark raving mad. I mean, this had to be the worst job in the entire world, didn't it? You never get used to the smell of decaying flesh. No one in their right mind gets used to a smell like that. It's a smell you can't forget. It can haunt your worst nightmares if you allow yourself to be tormented or haunted by what you've seen. Of course, doing a job shunned by most people means you see sights that might make your hair grow white overnight. I know that from personal experience, as within weeks after my first job, I noticed grey shoots in my hair. At 30, I am now totally grey, but my silvery locks do suit me. Then you see sights that you will never ever forget, like cleaning up after a double homicide, or even the body of an old lady that no one has seen for a very long time. It means our job can be clouded by a grievous sadness, but just like a surgeon having to deal with death on the operating table, you learn to disconnect from what you've seen. If you don't, it would easily destroy you, or eat you up alive. It may surprise you to learn that there are, of course, great big pluses to such an infelicious job of dealing with blood, guts and maggots. One of them is that you gain a true appreciation and wondrous awe of life. I know one mortician whom I'm personally rather well acquainted with, who shares my joyous cherishing of every single passing day. I've learnt one thing, that no matter how old we are, our lives are indeed a God-given gift that could so easily be snatched away from us at any moment. If there are any guarantees in life, one is the knowing that death comes after us all. From the moment we're born, we all face the same risk, irrespective of our age or gender. Death is non-discriminatory. It is not personal. It just is. Another benefit of my job is a reassurance that we can bring people who are suffering a grievous, very sad loss. It is amazing how some gentle, comforting words can graciously soothe, mollify, and perpetuate the most broken of hearts. For me personally, it's fulfilling being able to touch people's lives, who will wear their heart on their sleeves when they deal with a loss that is so personal to them. Sometimes in life you're led down an unlikely path, like we were, something that you never envisaged for your life. If someone were to have said to me back in my youth that I would clean up dead bodies for a living, I would have known that it had to be some kind of couth, unsavoury joke that I wouldn't have found amusing. It would never have been something I would willingly do. But all these years later, after industriously cleaning up after a suicide gunshot incident at my boss's house, who would have thought that the hands of fate would sweep Susan and me down this implausible path? We soon became firm friends. She no longer mixed in the circles of high society, for she was often shunned by most who had known her, as if in some way connecting with her would bring them down from their own preconceived pedestals. Maybe they were superstitious that a touch of her bad luck might rub off on them, become contagious rather like a deadly disease. I had witnessed well-heeled people, upon seeing Susan quickly flagging down a taxi, going to extreme lengths to avoid any kind of interaction with her. But she didn't care. She described her new middle-class life spent with me as like a rebirth of sorts. I lived in a small semi-detached apartment in Seattle, which we shared together. Neither of us were hitched with any men. It was funny when you meet people in the bar, mention what you do for a living. They suddenly give you a wide berth, quite literally, wanting to run away as far from you as possible, for the subject of death is one we would sooner brush under the carpet and pretend is not there. I have 2 stories on my crime scene clean-outs that will be of great interest to your listeners. The first story begins when it was raining cats and dogs in Seattle, which is always very symbolic for me. It's like the earth is crying as rain pelting down on my windscreen is to me poignantly reminiscent of sorrowful tears. Me and Susan were on our way to visit a home where a young lady had been murdered by her ex-boyfriend, who had decided promptly that if he couldn't live with her, then he would blow her brains out, which is exactly what he'd done. He'd broken surreptitiously into the family house during the dead of night, taking great measures not to be heard. The family were obliviously unaware of his presence. No one had considered that the dilapidated relationship that had fallen so badly apart, and had been precariously hanging by a shoestring, was still of any value or significance to the young man. Indeed, his attitude towards his girlfriend had been so indifferent, which is what makes the story all the more extraordinary. By all accounts, on the surface, he didn't hold his girlfriend in such high regard, so it would seem that by appearances things can be a lot more deceptive. Purportedly, the relationship had been wilting away like a dying flower in a vase for far too long. The young girl in question had nipped things in the bud, decided to end things after 5 long years. It would appear he was agreeable to this decision. "We haven't been working out," she had told him. "You've been losing your temper a lot. We've been involved in petty squawks. We both want different things in life. I think we should end things, go our separate ways." It would seem he had agreed with his girlfriend so graciously. The relationship had ended amicably. No one knew that under this indifferent, nonchalant facade, he was concealing a spewing, bubbling volcano that was about to erupt, burst its banks of furious, frothing, molten lava. Earlier on in the evening, the young man had seen his ex-girlfriend enjoying a drink with a stranger in a bar. It was like all hell broke loose. The floodbanks of his jealousy crossed the threshold of tolerance, seeping into anger, with an aggravation that gathered momentum, like a gale-force wind. Now he was doing something completely insane, beyond the boundaries of what is reasonable, as jealousy, when seasoned with the salt of provocation, can run a deadly course. Before the young man could reflect on his tumultuous behaviour, before he could consider the repercussions of his impulsive reactions, he had crept into the family home, tiptoeing into the young woman's bedroom, placing the cold metal gun to her head, pulling back the trigger. If there is any relief to be gained from the story, that was that the young girl experienced no fear, for she was thankfully fast asleep, not aware of the intruder hovering over her bed like a predatory bird. The loud noise of the gunshot woke up the entire household. Frightened screams from both parents melted into the foundations of the home like candle wax. As they went dashing towards their daughter's bedroom, they fell down on their hands and knees as they realized their daughter was dead. It's a parent's worst nightmare. We were called to the scene to clean up the body. It was the next-door neighbour that led us into her bedroom, where we had to remove the mattress, seal it up, and clean up the entire room. "The parents are too devastated to see anyone," she told us. "They're staying at my home with me. A grief counsellor is taking care of them. It's a dreadful, dreadful thing. Would you believe it? It was the boyfriend. A moment of complete, utter madness. I gather he pinched his father's revolver. Acted completely out of character. He's a very nice lad by all accounts. Terrible business," she said, shaking her head sadly. "Such a lovely young woman. Only 25, with her whole life ahead of her. Now the boyfriend's been incarcerated. What a dreadful waste of 2 such precious young lives." We agreed with the kind lady wholeheartedly. She led us to the outside of the room, shuddering. "How do you people do what you do? The mind boggles. I'm certainly not going in there myself, but thank God for people like you, willing to clean up this kind of mess. May God bless you both." We were left to our own devices, cleaning up the horror scene, feeling the sad energy in the room. I picked up a photograph on the sideboard in a gilt frame, showing it to Susan. "Pretty girl," I said, showing her the picture of the girl smiling in the camera, with long dark hair and green-blue eyes. "It's weird," I said to Susan, "but I feel as if we're both being watched, but there's no one here with us." It was an airy, haunting feeling. It seemed like the young woman's bedroom had become unnaturally cold. We both shivered. I looked at Susan. She held my gaze, but no words were spoken between us. We both sensed we weren't alone. We finished the job, cleaned up, throwing away all the disposable biohazard waste material. We ended up having an enjoyable evening at home that night. Of course, we tried not to discuss what happened during the day, so we tuned into a comedy show on television, then dutifully retired to bed. Before long, I drifted into a deep sleep. I woke up with a start, shivering from the cold, as the temperature in my room had become like an Arctic icebox. I got the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone, that someone was watching me. It sent nervous chills descending down my spine. Then I felt an icy cold hand touch me. I could actually feel the fingers. It was all I could do not to scream, but I was frozen in terror. That was when I saw the dead girl, whose remains we'd cleaned away earlier on in the day, standing there at the end of my bed in her nightdress, with an expression of bewilderment on her face. She looked at me with frightened eyes. I recognized her from her photograph, only her face was covered in blood on the side. Maybe she didn't realize she was dead, so that was what I decided to tell her. I said to her, "Christine, I don't know how to tell you this, but you're dead. Sadly, your ex-boyfriend killed you. Please find your peace. Please go to the light." The girl looked at her body, looked at me. She looked astonished, and then she just vanished. The room regained its warmth. I was to discover that Susan had an experience of her own. She had woken up to someone saying, "Help me," but when she looked around the room, she saw no one there. It was a haunting experience for her. Luckily, we never saw the girl again, so we hoped that she finally found her peace. Another time we were called out to a property outside Seattle, where a woman had tragically been found by her daughter, having tripped over her shoelace, lying deceased at the bottom of the stairs. By all accounts, she'd hit the flagstone floor so terribly hard that she'd cracked open her skull. The coroner said that her death was instantaneous and immediate. She would have known nothing about it, which was certainly reassuring to hear. We were very surprised to find the property was in a rather remote area, far off the beaten track. We found ourselves on some cracked roads, where rambunctious weeds had pushed their tough roots through the asphalt that was now bespeckled with broken pieces of road and pebbles. On either side of the road were elevated hilly embankments, lined with tall statuesque trees in varying shades of viridescent greens. It was a high probability that we may have passed a couple of rural properties, but everything appeared to be surrounded by trees, still more trees, and even more, so you couldn't be sure of anything. We found our way to the pebbled road that snaked directly to the wooden cabin. A woman with grey hair was standing outside her truck, leaning against the metal carcass, staring vacantly into space with that shocked, rather bemused look on her face that we often encountered in the grieving process. We surmised that this must be the daughter of the woman that died. She looked desperately distressed, her eyes rimmed with bright pink marks, which suggested she'd been having a jolly good cry. She looked upon us as we climbed out of the truck, quickly wiping away her eyes with her sleeves, trying to look as stoic as possible. I was used to people being brave and courageous, but it really wasn't necessary. "I'm so glad you've come. There's quite a lot of mess, I'm afraid. The coroner's taken her body, but there are pieces left behind, you know." We nodded. "I'm so sorry for your loss, ma'am. Do you know how many times I've tried to teach my mother to tie up her laces? You know, even last week I showed her this site on YouTube, which teaches you to tie up your laces correctly so that they don't come undone, so you don't trip over them. My mother could be so bloody minded. She always thought she knew better. But I cannot tell you how many times she tripped over those laces of hers. I so worried that something like this would invariably happen. But a cracked skull, I never imagined that, nor the mess that it would create. Oh, what a mess! She must have tripped over her laces, flung her head on the flagstone floor, cracked it open, like an ostrich egg. Can you imagine anything more horrific? I'm very sorry, ma'am. It certainly can't be easy for you finding her like that. There's no way to say this, but accidents do happen." You've been doing this business for a long time, have you not?" she asked us. "Do you think that our time is written, that we're meant to go when we go, even if our death is of a traumatic kind? Do you think it's possibly preordained, written in the stars?" The woman looked at us for reassurance, as if somehow we had all the answers to life's questions. "Well, there's a part of me that thinks that, ma'am. I do personally believe that there has to be a divine purpose behind everything. Otherwise, nothing would make any sense at all." "It just would make me feel a lot better," said the woman, if I knew that there would be nothing that I could have done to change what happened to her, that despite everything, that she was meant to go when she did." "Maybe she was," I said. "You're nice," said the lady, "very nice. In truth, I was expecting you to be both men. I'm pleasantly surprised you're a woman doing this job. Very pleasantly surprised. Look, I'm so sorry to prattle on about my mother like this, but she was a good woman. She had a heart of gold on her, lived out in nature. She was 75 years old, as fit as a fiddle. But I so warned her about those laces. I told her they would be the death of her. It seems I was right. Well, as I was saying, accidents do happen. It's a fact of life. It's tragic. I'm sorry. Well, it can't be helped, said the woman, blowing her nose loudly in a tissue that she pulled out from the pocket of her jacket. Just make your way through the front. The mess is at the bottom of the staircase, she told us. Are you sure you're going to be all right? I asked. I'll be fine. I'll leave it to you then. Just close the door behind you when you are finished. It's been so nice to meet you both. I just wish we could have met under brighter circumstances. Still, it can't be helped. We watched the lovely woman leave. She climbed into her truck, driving away. Our eyes drank in the prettiness of the cute little rustic wooden cabin, like a delicious, refreshing drink. It was nestled in the middle of a flowering meadow, like something you might see on Little House on the Prairie. Soft, gentle beams of sunlight infused the long grasses in an ethereal golden glaze. As it was still quite early in the morning, there was a dewy, moist freshness to the air that you could almost taste on the tip of your tongue. The little tight petals of the wild flowers slowly began to open their heads as their hungry petals lapped up the morning light, while pretty celestial butterflies darted over their budding heads. Then clusters of tall ponderosa pines stood up proud like slender giants, dressed in their pompous verdant regalia, with boughs of needles that swayed like little hands. In the furthest distance I could see the undulating shapes of the hills, bowing their great girths under the cobalt blue sky, in a solitary still worship. For a moment me and Susan were transfixed by the beguiling scenic views, the smell of fragrant flowers on the wind, the sound of pretty bird song. Then we jolted back to reality, remembering the less than glamorous job we had undertaken to do. We sighed warily as we opened the back of our trunk and began to dress in our biohazard gear. We entered the cabin. A sadness, of course, engulfed us as a bloody pool greeted our eyes at the bottom of the stairs. We bagged up a single trainer that was caked in blood. As we were bagging up our materials, suddenly we saw moving through the trees, gliding towards us, a Bigfoot. The critter's face bore an expression of deep concern as she moved boldly towards us, abandoning her reticence as an afterthought, for in her heightened level of anxiety she clearly sensed that something was terribly wrong. She looked bewildered and nonplussed as she ran towards the house, barely acknowledging us in the process. She stood at the door. She whistled. I stood there with the bag in my hand, so uncertain of what I should do. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. The creature was behaving like she knew that something was intrinsically wrong. It was clear to me she must have had a friendship with the old woman. She turned around and looked at us. Her deep dark eyes were questioning and probing, as if she wanted to know what had happened to the old woman. I opened up the bag, pulled out the shoe that was covered in blood. Then I pointed to the house. The Bigfoot glided towards me. She took the shoe from my hands, her face a picture of such inexplicable grief. I'm sorry, I said. She died. It was like the creature knew exactly what I was saying. She let out an excruciating howl. She began to lament by beating her chest powerfully hard. She took the shoe in her hand so lovingly, holding it close to her chest. She looked at us with such a deep sadness. Then she glided away into the trees. We could hear her howling from the valley. Me and Susan looked at each other with baffled expressions on our faces. It was clear to us that this female Bigfoot had a deep friendship with the old woman. I never knew a Bigfoot was real, said Susan, gasping in astonishment. The one thing about this job is it never ceases to surprise me. The things that happen to us, the things that we learn. I mean, how big was that creature? Easily 8 foot tall, I said. Possibly 600 to 700 pounds. But it was so human-looking. The face! Didn't you think that face was human? I did, I agreed. Although the overlong arms, the long dark flowing hair, the cone-shaped head did have ape-like influences. After we cleaned up, I phoned up the daughter of the old woman that died. Obviously, I wasn't going to tell her about the Bigfoot we'd encountered, but I did say this. Wasn't it lonely for your mother living out there in such a remote cabin? Her daughter said to me, "That's a funny thing. She told me she had a great friend there, that she was never alone, but I never met the friend. I'm not sure who she was talking about." I was in no doubt that the mysterious friend was certainly the Bigfoot we encountered. If there is any thought I would give to your listeners, it is to live your life to the fullest, to never believe someone has it better than you, because more likely than not, they don't. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.